The strangest thing about war is not how much hatred it creates, but how desperately people still search for kindness after it ends. Snow drifted through the shattered streets of Berlin like ashes that refused to settle. The war had ended months ago, but the city still looked as though it had stopped breathing. Buildings stood hollow against the gray December sky. Church bells no longer rang. Windows were boarded with splintered wood. Somewhere in the distance, a train groaned across frozen tracks, its sound dragging slowly through the cold morning air. Inside the basement of an abandoned Lutheran church, 32 German children sat in silence beneath flickering candlelight. No one laughed. No one cried anymore either. Hunger had a way of stealing both sounds from children. 11-year-old Elsa Bauer sat near the wall with her knees pressed against her chest, her small fingers wrapped tightly around a faded wool scarf that had once belonged to her mother. The scarf smelled faintly of smoke now. Almost everything in Berlin smelled like smoke. Around her, younger children stared at the floor while volunteers poured thin potato soup into metal bowls. The soup was watery enough to reflect the candlelight. Elsa waited until everyone else had eaten before lifting her spoon. She always waited. Across the room, an older woman hurried down the church stairs, brushing snow from her coat. Her breathing was uneven. Nervous. "The Americans are coming," she whispered. At once, the room changed. Several children lowered their heads. One little boy dropped his spoon. Another pulled a blanket over his shoulders as if it could hide him. Elsa did not move at all, but her fingers tightened around the scarf. For years, adults had spoken about soldiers in frightened voices. German soldiers, Russian soldiers, American soldiers. To children, uniforms had become something larger than nations. They meant uncertainty, boots on staircases, doors opening without warning. Taking, always taking. Outside, engines rumbled through the narrow street. Heavy tires rolled over frozen slush. The sound grew louder until it stopped directly in front of the church. Then came silence. Thick silence. The kind that made every child stop breathing for a moment. A few seconds later, the church door creaked open upstairs. Cold wind swept down the stairwell. Elsa heard unfamiliar voices speaking English. Calm voices. Tired voices. Boots echoed slowly against old wooden steps as several American soldiers descended into the basement carrying supply crates. The children stared at them without blinking. The Americans looked different from what Elsa expected. They were younger, exhausted. One soldier's gloves were patched at the fingertips. Another carried a coffee tin tucked into his coat pocket. Their uniforms smelled of snow, gasoline, and winter air. Then Captain Thomas Reed stepped forward. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face worn by too many sleepless nights. He removed his gloves before speaking, as though he understood something important about entering a room full of frightened children. One of the soldiers opened a crate and began handing out fresh bread wrapped in brown paper. Real bread, warm enough for steam to rise into the cold basement air. A younger boy beside Elsa reached for it immediately, but Elsa caught his sleeve before his fingers touched the loaf. The American soldier paused. Thomas noticed. "It's okay," he said gently. "You can take it." Elsa slowly looked up at him. Her blue eyes were steady despite the hunger hollowing her face. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, in careful English shaped by a soft German accent, she quietly said, "My mother told me soldiers always take something back." The basement fell completely silent. Even the younger children looked up. Thomas Reed stood frozen with the loaf still in his hand. Snow swirled faintly outside the broken church windows. Somewhere above them, wind scraped against shattered glass. But inside that basement, one exhausted American captain suddenly realized the war had not ended for these children at all. Captain Thomas Reed did not answer Elsa right away. He simply lowered the loaf of bread into her hands and moved to the next child. The basement remained quiet except for the soft rustling of paper and the distant wind outside. Elsa stared at the bread for several seconds before placing it carefully beside her without eating it. Around her, the younger children began accepting their portions one by one. Some held the bread as though it might disappear if they blinked too long. Others tucked pieces into their pockets for later. Hunger had taught them all the same lesson. Never trust today to feed tomorrow. Thomas watched the room as his men unloaded blankets, canned milk, and medical supplies near the church wall. Sergeant Daniel Brooks crouched beside a little boy no older than 6 and offered him a wool cap from his own coat pocket. The child hesitated before taking it slowly. Daniel smiled, but the boy did not smile back. None of them did. Thomas had seen battlefields across Europe. He had seen cities burned black by war, and soldiers too exhausted to speak. But this felt different. The silence inside that church carried something heavier than destruction. It was the silence of children who no longer expected kindness from anyone. He glanced again toward Elsa. She sat perfectly still while two smaller girls leaned against her shoulders. One of them had fallen asleep despite the cold. Elsa carefully adjusted the blanket around the child without disturbing her. The movement was automatic, almost maternal. Thomas frowned slightly. 11 years old, he thought. Maybe 12 at most. Yet the girl moved like someone much older. Upstairs, snow continued falling across Berlin in thick white sheets. Through the cracked church windows, Thomas could see the city fading into pale gray darkness, even though it was only afternoon. The winter air cut through every broken wall and shattered rooftop. One of the volunteers approached him quietly. Most of them lost their families during the evacuations, she explained in tired English. Some do not know if their parents are alive. Some stopped asking. Thomas nodded slowly. He removed his gloves and rubbed warmth back into his hands. Even inside the church, his breath drifted visibly in front of him. How long have they been here, he asked. Since October. Thomas looked around again. Thin blankets, rusted cots, damp stone floors. 32 children surviving on soup and candles through a Berlin. Winter. His jaw tightened. Near the far wall, one of his younger soldiers opened a crate filled with chocolate bars from army rations. The moment the wrappers appeared, several children stared at them with wide eyes. The soldier grinned and began passing them out carefully. A little girl near Elsa accepted hers with trembling fingers, immediately trying to break it evenly into 3 smaller pieces for the others beside her. Thomas noticed something then. Not a single child fought over food. Not one grabbed. Not one complained. They shared automatically, as though survival had taught them to protect each other before themselves. Elsa finally lifted the bread into her lap. She tore off a small piece and handed it first to the sleeping girl beside her once the child stirred awake. Only after the younger children had eaten did Elsa take a bite for herself. Thomas looked away for a moment, suddenly ashamed of the untouched dinner waiting back at headquarters. One of the church candles flickered weakly as cold air drifted through the basement stairwell again. Outside, a military truck engine started somewhere in the street. The sound echoed through the ruined neighborhood before fading into the snowy distance. Thomas checked his watch. His unit was supposed to continue south before morning. Another assignment. Another city. Another list of orders. Yet for the first time in months, he found himself dreading the next destination. As his men finished distributing supplies, Sergeant Brooks walked beside him quietly. "Captain," he murmured, keeping his voice low enough that the children would not hear. "What happens to them after we leave?" Thomas did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Elsa as she folded the brown bread paper neatly beside her scarf instead of throwing it away. Saving it, perhaps, because even paper could become useful in winter. Finally, Thomas exhaled slowly. "I do not know," he admitted. And somehow, that answer felt worse than anything he had seen during the war. That night, Berlin disappeared beneath another layer of snow. Wind pushed through the ruined streets in long hollow whistles, slipping between collapsed buildings and shattered stone walls like the city itself was trying to breathe through broken lungs. Captain Thomas Reed lay awake inside the temporary American headquarters nearly half a mile from the church basement, staring at the cracked ceiling above his cot, while dozens of exhausted soldiers slept around him. The room smelled of wet wool, cigarette smoke, and strong coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Somewhere nearby, a radio crackled softly before fading into static. Thomas closed his eyes, but every time he did, he saw the children again. Thin hands clutching bread, hollow faces watching strangers with fear instead of hope, and Elsa's voice repeating quietly in his mind. "My mother told me soldiers always take something back." He turned onto his side and checked his watch. Nearly 2 in the morning. Outside, snow tapped gently against the windows of the old government building the army had converted into barracks. Thomas sat up slowly and rubbed both hands across his face. During the war, exhaustion usually came easily. Men slept because their bodies demanded it. But now the fighting was over, and somehow the silence had become harder to carry. Across the room, Sergeant Daniel Brooks snored softly beneath two army blankets while another soldier muttered in his sleep near the stove. Thomas stood carefully, pulled on his heavy coat, and reached for the untouched dinner tray sitting near his cot. Powdered eggs, bread, a small tin of canned peaches. He stared at it for several seconds before wrapping the food back inside the cloth napkin. 20 minutes later, his boots crunched across frozen streets beneath a dark gray sky. Berlin looked ghostly at night. Snow-covered piles of brick and broken glass, softening the destruction beneath white silence. Thomas passed burned-out storefronts and abandoned bicycles half buried in slush. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang faintly for the first time in weeks. The sound startled him. He had forgotten what bells were supposed to sound like without air raid sirens around them. When he reached the church basement, he found only one candle still burning near the stairs. Most of the children slept beneath mismatched blankets lined across the floor. A few coughed quietly in their sleep. One little boy clutched a wooden toy truck missing two wheels. Thomas removed his gloves and moved carefully through the room so his boots would not wake anyone. Then he noticed Elsa sitting awake near the far wall. She looked up immediately, as though she had not been sleeping at all. The candlelight reflected softly in her pale blue eyes. "You should be asleep," Thomas whispered. Elsa glanced toward the younger children beside her. "Clara has a fever," she answered quietly in English. Thomas looked down at the small girl sleeping with her head against Elsa's shoulder. Even in the dim light, he could see redness in the child's cheeks. Elsa gently pressed a damp cloth against the little girl's forehead. "The doctor came yesterday," she said softly. "But medicine is hard to find now." Thomas crouched beside them without speaking for a moment. The basement felt even colder at night. He could see his own breath drifting between them in thin clouds. Finally, he held out the wrapped dinner from headquarters. Elsa looked at it carefully, but did not reach for it. "It is extra," Thomas explained. "No one will miss it." For a second, neither of them moved. Then Elsa slowly accepted the bundle and opened the cloth just enough to see the peaches inside. The younger girl beside her stirred weakly at the smell of food. Without hesitation, Elsa picked up the spoon and fed the child first. Thomas watched quietly. She did not even glance toward the bread for herself. Somewhere above them, wind rattled loose boards against the church walls. Thomas leaned back slightly against the cold stone pillar and realized something uncomfortable settling heavily into his chest. During the war, he had spent years learning how to survive destruction. But no one had ever taught him what came after. No manual explained how to walk away from children left behind by history. Elsa looked over at him after the little girl had fallen asleep again. "Why did you come back?" she asked softly. Thomas stared at the flickering candle near the stairs for a long moment before answering honestly. "Because I could not stop thinking about this place." Elsa lowered her eyes toward the sleeping children around her. Then, almost too quietly to hear, she said, "Neither could we." The next morning arrived beneath a sky the color of cold steel. Snow still covered the streets of Berlin, but the storm had finally passed, leaving the city wrapped in an uneasy silence. Captain Thomas Reed stood outside the church basement with a steaming tin cup of coffee warming his hands while American trucks moved slowly through the avenue behind him. Soldiers unloaded crates of coal, blankets, and canned food for nearby shelters. Somewhere farther down the street, someone played a piano inside a damaged apartment building. The melody drifted softly through the frozen air before stopping suddenly after only a few notes. Thomas found himself listening for it again. He had started noticing small sounds lately. Children coughing, soup spoons against metal bowls, wine through shattered windows. Before the war ended, he had stopped hearing things like that. Survival did not leave much room for quiet details. The church door opened behind him. Elsa stepped outside carrying an empty bucket nearly half her size. Her cheeks were pale from the cold, but she walked carefully across the icy stone steps without complaining. Thomas immediately took the bucket from her hands. "Where are you going with this?" he asked. "The water pump," Elsa answered simply. Thomas glanced toward the end of the street where civilians waited in long lines beside a frozen public well. "You should not carry this alone." Elsa shrugged lightly beneath her oversized gray coat. "Everybody carries something now." Thomas looked at her for a moment before walking beside her down the snow-covered sidewalk. The city moved slowly around them. Women pushed wooden carts filled with firewood scraps. Elderly men swept snow away from damaged storefronts. Children wandered through the ruins wrapped in blankets too large for their shoulders. Every face seemed tired in the same quiet way. As they reached the waterline, several civilians glanced nervously at Thomas's uniform before lowering their eyes again. Elsa noticed it too. "They still do not trust Americans," she said softly. Thomas nodded once. "Some Americans do not trust Germans either." Elsa looked ahead at the line without answering. After a moment, she said quietly, "Children are the only ones who did not start any of it." The sentence settled heavily between them. Thomas stared at the frozen ground for a second before finally saying, "You sound older than 11. Elsa adjusted the scarf around her neck. "I was 10 when the war ended." Thomas understood what she meant. Some people aged by birthdays. Others aged by winters. When they returned to the church basement carrying water, Thomas stopped near the stairwell after hearing voices inside. Two younger children sat beside Elsa's blanket while she carefully held an old piece of paper beneath the candlelight. One little boy pointed at a line of English words printed across the page. Elsa translated quietly into German while the children listened with complete attention. Thomas stepped closer. The paper was an old American newspaper page someone had used as wrapping material. "You can read English?" he asked. Elsa looked up, slightly startled. "A little. Where did you learn?" "My mother taught languages before the war." She lowered her eyes briefly before continuing. "English, French, sometimes Italian." Thomas crouched beside the children and picked up another paper from the floor. Elsa translated several sentences slowly but clearly. Her pronunciation was careful, almost formal, like someone remembering lessons from another lifetime. The younger children stared at her with admiration. Suddenly Thomas realized why they gathered around her so often. Elsa did not just care for them. She gave them something even more valuable than food. She gave them calm. One of the smaller boys tugged lightly at Elsa's sleeve and handed her a folded envelope. The paper looked worn and dirty from being carried too long. Elsa opened it carefully. "He wants to know if this says where his father is," she explained quietly. Thomas watched as she studied the English military stamp on the envelope. The candle flickered beside her face while snow tapped softly against the church windows overhead. Finally, Elsa translated the letter gently into German. For the little boy, the child listened without blinking, clutching the edge of his blanket the entire time. When she finished, he lowered his head silently, but moved closer beside her shoulder. Elsa said nothing else. She simply rested one hand lightly against the boy's back. Thomas looked around the basement again. The children were still cold, still hungry, still uncertain about tomorrow. But now he noticed something he had missed before. In the middle of all this ruin, one quiet little girl had somehow become the closest thing they had to home. 3 days later, the snowstorm returned harder than before. Thick white wind swept through Berlin before sunrise, covering roads, burying abandoned bicycles, and swallowing entire alleyways beneath drifts nearly 2 feet deep. By afternoon, visibility had dropped so low that even the American trucks moved slowly through the city with headlights glowing faintly behind curtains of snow. Inside the church basement, candles flickered against the stone walls while children huddled together beneath blankets listening to the storm above them. The old church groaned each time the wind slammed against its damaged roof. Captain Thomas Reed arrived shortly before dusk, carrying additional coal wrapped beneath a canvas tarp over his shoulders. Sergeant Daniel Brooks followed behind him, with canned soup balanced carefully in both arms. The moment the children saw them descending the stairs, several smaller faces brightened for the first time in days. Not with excitement exactly. Something quieter than that. Relief. Thomas noticed Elsa sitting beside the youngest children near the stove, helping them play a game using small pebbles arranged in careful rows across the floor. She looked up when he entered. "The storm is getting worse," Thomas said while brushing snow from his coat sleeves. Elsa nodded once. The roof was shaking all morning. As the soldiers distributed soup bowls, the church basement slowly filled with the soft sound of spoons against metal. Steam rose into the cold air, carrying the smell of potatoes and onions. For a few minutes, the room almost felt normal. Then the church door upstairs suddenly slammed open so violently that several children jumped. Wind rushed through the stairwell, carrying snowflakes into the basement. A frightened civilian woman stumbled halfway down the stairs, breathless and pale. "A child is missing," she cried in German. "Near Friedrichstrasse." The room froze instantly. Elsa stood before anyone else did. "Who?" she asked sharply. "Little Marta from the northern shelter," the woman answered. She ran outside after her brother. Thomas exchanged one quick glance with Sergeant Brooks before reaching for his gloves. "How old?" "5. The soldiers moved immediately. Within minutes, Thomas and 3 men stepped back into the storm carrying lanterns while snow whipped across the streets hard enough to sting exposed skin. Elsa followed them before Thomas noticed. "No," he said firmly over the wind. "You stay at the church." Elsa shook her head. "I know the alleys better than you do." Snow clung to her scarf, and eyelashes while freezing air turned her cheeks red. Thomas hesitated only briefly before nodding once. "Stay close to me." Together they pushed through the blizzard beneath dim streetlights barely visible through the snow. Berlin looked almost erased beneath the storm. Buildings faded into white shadows. Footprints disappeared within seconds. Somewhere in the distance, loose metal signs banged against walls in the wind. They searched street after street calling the little girl's name. No answer came back except the storm itself. After nearly 40 minutes, Sergeant Brooks pointed toward a narrow alley partially blocked by collapsed bricks and frozen debris. Small footprints disappeared into the snow there. Thomas lifted his lantern higher and moved forward carefully. "Marta," he shouted. Nothing. Then Elsa suddenly stopped walking. "Wait." Everyone fell silent. Beneath the howl of the wind came a faint sound. Crying. Weak. Almost buried by the storm. Elsa dropped to her knees immediately beside a mound of broken timber near the alley wall. Without hesitation, she began digging through snow with bare hands. Thomas joined her at once while the soldiers pulled debris aside piece by piece. Finally, beneath a collapsed wooden beam, they found the little girl curled tightly against the frozen ground. Marta was shivering violently, clutching a smaller toddler beneath her coat. Neither child could have survived much longer in the cold. Elsa wrapped both children inside her own coat before Thomas could stop her. The wind tore through the alley while snow gathered across her shoulders and hair almost instantly. "You are freezing," Thomas said urgently. Elsa barely looked at him. She held the younger child tightly against her chest, rubbing warmth back into the girl's tiny hands. "She is colder," Elsa answered softly. For a moment, no one spoke. Sergeant Brooks turned away slightly, removing his hat as though he suddenly needed air. Another soldier quietly wiped snow from his face, though Thomas knew it was not only snow anymore. Then Thomas carefully lifted the children into his arms while Elsa struggled to stand beside him, her fingers trembling from the cold. Around them, the storm continued swallowing the ruined city whole. But in the middle of that frozen alley, surrounded by soldiers who had once crossed an ocean to fight a war, one small German girl had reminded them all what it meant to protect someone weaker than yourself. When they returned to the church, every candle in the basement was burning. The children had been waiting near the stairs in complete silence, listening to the storm outside and praying for footsteps to return through the snow. The moment Elsa appeared carrying the rescued toddler wrapped inside her coat, several younger children rushed toward her at once. Little Marta began crying softly into Sergeant Brooks's shoulder the second she saw familiar faces again. One of the older women covered her mouth with trembling hands before sitting down heavily on a wooden crate, overcome with relief too deep for words. Snow melted from the soldiers' coats onto the stone floor, while wind still rattled the windows above them. Captain Thomas Reed carefully lowered the children beside the stove where the warmest blankets had already been prepared. Elsa remained standing near the stairs for a moment, shivering quietly without seeming to notice it herself. Her hands were bright red from the cold. One sleeve of her coat had frozen stiff with snow. Thomas stepped toward her immediately and placed his heavy army blanket around her shoulders before she could refuse it. Elsa looked startled by the gesture. "You need it more," Thomas said softly. For once, Elsa did not argue. Across the room, Sergeant Brooks knelt beside the rescued toddler and handed the little girl a steaming cup of broth. The child wrapped both hands around it carefully as though afraid the warmth might disappear. Nearby, another American soldier removed his dry socks and placed them beside the stove so Marta's feet could warm slowly. No one gave orders. No one discussed protocol. The soldiers simply moved through the basement helping however they could, as naturally as breathing. Thomas stood quietly near the candlelight watching his men. Weeks ago, Many of them had spoken only about getting home to America. Now they spent their nights repairing blankets, carrying water buckets, and calming frightened children through winter storms. War had changed all of them, but somehow these children were changing them again. Elsa sat near the stove while one of the volunteers rubbed warmth back into her hands. The younger children slowly gathered around her once more, drawn toward her calm presence the same way cold people gather around fire. Thomas noticed little Marta refusing to let go of Elsa's sleeve even after drinking her soup. The child kept glancing up at her as though needing proof she was still there. After a while, Elsa quietly began telling the younger children a story in German. Thomas could not understand every word, but he recognized enough to follow the rhythm. It was about a small bird surviving winter by sheltering beneath broken rooftops until spring returned. The children listened without interrupting. Even the storm outside seemed quieter somehow while she spoke. Sergeant Brooks leaned beside Thomas near the church wall. "She kept those kids alive before we got here," he murmured. Thomas nodded slowly. "I think she did more than that." The basement lights flickered briefly as the wind surged again outside. Somewhere above them, loose church bells shifted faintly in the tower but never fully rang. Thomas glanced toward the stairwell where snow continued slipping beneath the door in thin white trails. Tomorrow his unit was scheduled to receive new orders from command. There had already been rumors about troop rotations and relocation assignments farther south. Supplies were growing tighter across Berlin. Shelters would be reorganized. Civilians moved. Children transferred. The thought settled heavily inside his chest. He looked back toward Elsa just as one of the younger boys fell asleep against her shoulder mid-story. She gently adjusted the blanket around him without stopping her quiet voice. Thomas suddenly realized something uncomfortable. The church no longer felt temporary to him. The children no longer felt like strangers caught in someone else's tragedy. They had become part of the rhythm of his days. Morning coffee before walking to the church. Counting blankets during snowstorms. Listening for Elsa translating letters near candlelight. Watching soldiers who once carried rifles, now carrying sleeping children instead. A few feet away, Sergeant Brooks quietly cleared his throat. "Captain," he said carefully, "what happens if command sends us out next week?" Thomas stared at the basement floor for several long seconds before answering. The room around him smelled of coal smoke, soup broth, and damp while drying near the stove. Children breathed softly beneath blankets while snow continued falling outside the ruined city. Finally, Thomas spoke so quietly that only Brooks could hear him. "Then we find a way to keep them safe anyway." Brooks looked at him for a moment, understanding more from the tone than the words themselves. Across the basement, Elsa glanced briefly toward Thomas as though she sensed the weight of that promise before he even fully understood it himself. The official orders arrived the following afternoon inside a sealed brown envelope marked with the insignia of the United States Army Command Division. Captain Thomas Reed read the document twice beneath the dim light of headquarters while snowmelt dripped slowly from soldiers' boots onto the wooden floor around him. Transfer scheduled within 72 hours. Southern reassignment near Frankfurt. Civilian shelters to be consolidated under temporary international relief management. Thomas lowered the paper slowly without speaking. Around him, several officers continued discussing fuel shortages and transportation routes, but their voices sounded distant now. All he could think about was the church basement. 32 children. Thin blankets. Candlelight. Elsa translating letters beside the stove. He folded the orders carefully and slipped them into his coat pocket before leaving the room. Outside, Berlin had finally begun thawing under weak winter sunlight. Snow dripped from damaged rooftops in steady rhythms, while civilians cleared narrow pathways through slush-covered streets. The city still looked wounded, but for the first time in weeks, Thomas could smell something other than smoke in the air. Bread. Someone nearby had reopened a bakery using salvaged ovens. The smell followed him almost the entire walk to the church. When he entered the basement that evening, the children were gathered around Sergeant Brooks, who sat awkwardly on an overturned crate trying to teach them an American card game using bent playing cards from his uniform pocket. Several younger boys laughed quietly every time Brooks exaggerated his serious expression after losing a round. It was the first real laughter Thomas had heard inside those walls. Elsa noticed him immediately. "You are late today," she said softly while organizing folded blankets near the stove. Thomas removed his gloves slowly. We received new orders. The room suddenly felt colder despite the fire burning nearby. Elsa looked at him carefully, but did not ask the question directly. She already understood. The soldiers were leaving. Nearby, Brooks continued entertaining the younger children, though Thomas noticed his smile fading slightly once their eyes met across the room. Later that evening, after the children had settled beneath blankets, Thomas stood near the church stairwell staring at snow melt sliding down cracked stained glass windows. Elsa approached quietly beside him carrying 2 steaming cups of weak tea made from dried herbs. She handed one to him without speaking. For several moments, they simply listened to the faint sound of wind moving through the church tower above them. When Elsa finally asked, 3 days. She nodded once, staring down into her cup. No anger, no pleading. Somehow that made it worse. Thomas rested both hands around the warm tin cup. Relief workers are supposed to take over the shelters. Elsa gave the smallest shrug. Supposed to. The words landed heavily between them because both of them understood what happened too often in cities still buried beneath war. Supplies disappeared. Records vanished. Children were moved from place to place until no one remembered their names anymore. Thomas exhaled slowly. I am trying to speak with command. Elsa looked up at him then. Candlelight flickered softly across her face while shadows moved against the church walls behind her. Why? She asked quietly. Thomas opened his mouth to answer, but stopped. Because leaving felt wrong. Because every soldier in his unit had already become attached to children they were never supposed to know. Because war had spent years teaching men how to destroy things, and now suddenly they had found something worth protecting instead. But none of those thoughts fully explained it. Finally, Thomas answered with the only truth he could find. Because someone should stay. Elsa lowered her eyes again toward the steaming tea in her hands. The church remained silent except for distant breathing from sleeping children. Then, after a long pause, Elsa spoke so softly Thomas almost missed it. People always leave eventually. The sentence carried no accusation, only experience. Thomas looked across the basement toward the children sleeping beneath borrowed army blankets. Little Marta curled against Elsa's old scarf. The younger boys still clutching wooden toys carved by American soldiers during long winter nights. One child snoring softly beside a stack of canned food crates. None of them looked afraid while the soldiers were there. That realization hit Thomas harder than any battlefield memory ever had. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small pair of wool gloves lined with dark brown leather at the palms. American-made, thick enough for heavy snow. He handed them to Elsa. She stared at them in surprise. Your hands were freezing during the storm, he said quietly. Elsa touched the gloves carefully, almost uncertain whether she should accept them. Then she slipped them on slowly. They were slightly too large, but warmth immediately returned to her fingers. For the first time since Thomas had met her, something changed in Elsa's expression. Not a full smile. Something smaller. Softer. A guarded piece of light returning after too many dark winters. Thomas noticed it instantly. And somehow, that small almost smile felt more important than every medal stored back inside his duffel bag at headquarters. The next morning, the church basement felt different. No one said it aloud, but the children had already sensed the coming goodbye. Their voices were quieter during breakfast. Even the younger ones stayed closer to the American soldiers than usual, as though distance itself had become something frightening again. Captain Thomas Reed spent most of the morning walking between military offices across Berlin, trying to delay the transfer orders. Every answer sounded the same. Resources were stretched thin. Troops had to move. Civilian relief programs would assume responsibility soon. One officer even reminded Thomas that the children were not officially under military protection to begin with. That sentence stayed with him long after the meeting ended. Not officially under protection, as if paperwork determined whether a child deserved safety. By late afternoon, Thomas returned to the church exhausted and carrying another stack of forms beneath his arm. Snowmelt dripped steadily from the edges of the church roof, while weak sunlight filtered through damaged stained glass overhead. Inside the basement, Sergeant Brooks and 2 soldiers were repairing one of the broken cots using scavenged wood and spare army rope. One of the younger boys sat nearby watching them carefully as though learning an important craft. Elsa stood beside the stove stirring soup inside a large metal pot. The leather gloves Thomas had given her rested neatly beside the fire to dry. You came back, little. Marta said the moment Thomas entered. The words were simple, but they landed harder than they should have. Thomas crouched beside her with a tired smile. I said I would. Marta nodded seriously, accepting the answer as though promises still meant something absolute to children. Across the room, Elsa quietly handed bowls of soup to the smaller children first before serving herself last as always. Thomas noticed one of his soldiers helping a little boy tie his boots near the wall, while another carefully stitched a torn blanket using dark green military thread. None of these men had children of their own back home. A few months ago, most of them barely knew how to speak gently anymore after years spent surviving war. Yet now they moved through the basement with patient voices and careful hands, learning kindness one small task at a time. Thomas leaned against the church pillar beside Brooks. How bad was headquarters? Brooks asked quietly. Thomas gave a faint, tired laugh. About as bad as expected. Brooks tightened the final knot on the repaired cot before looking up. Then maybe we stop asking. Thomas turned toward him slowly. What does that mean? Brooks hesitated for a second before speaking carefully. It means maybe these kids need more than temporary shelter. The basement suddenly felt very still around them. Thomas looked across the room toward Elsa, helping little Marta hold a spoon properly while the child ate soup beside the stove. Nearby, one soldier carved tiny wooden animals using his pocket knife, while 3 children watched with complete fascination. Another soldier sat cross-legged on the floor, teaching simple English words from an old army map. The church no longer looked like a relief station. It looked like something far more dangerous to leave behind. It looked like a family beginning accidentally. Later that evening, snow started falling lightly again outside the broken church windows. The children gathered close together while Sergeant Brooks attempted to read an American fairy tale aloud from memory, forgetting half the details and inventing the rest. The younger children laughed every time he changed the voices dramatically. Even Thomas smiled despite himself. Elsa sat quietly nearby, mending a child's coat, sleeve beneath candlelight. Thomas walked over and lowered himself beside her on the floor. You sew well, he said softly. Elsa shrugged slightly. My mother taught me before the war. Thomas watched her work carefully for a moment before asking the question that had been sitting heavily inside him all day. If they moved the children to another shelter, would you stay with them? Elsa stopped sewing. The room remained filled with soft laughter from the story across the basement, but her expression changed immediately. They separate children sometimes, she answered quietly. Especially older ones. Thomas frowned. Older? Elsa looked down toward the needle in her hand. They think younger children are easier to place with families. The words were calm, but Thomas heard the truth beneath them. Elsa was not afraid for herself. She was afraid for the smaller children depending on her. For a long moment, Thomas said nothing at all. Then he glanced across the basement at his men sitting beside children who already trusted them enough to fall asleep against their shoulders. Something settled inside him then. Not an idea. A decision. Quiet. Certain. He stood slowly and looked toward Brooks across the room. The sergeant met his eyes instantly, as though he already understood before a single word was spoken. Thomas slipped the folded transfer papers from his coat pocket, stared at them once, then placed them directly into the stove fire beside Elsa. The edges curled black almost immediately beneath the flames. Elsa looked up at him in shock. Thomas watched the papers disappear into ash before speaking quietly enough that only she could hear. Then we keep them. 40 years later, the winter air over Arlington National Cemetery carried the same quiet, cold Elsa Bauer remembered from Berlin. Snow rested lightly across the rows of white headstones stretching over the hills beneath a pale December sky. The world had changed since the war. Cities had been rebuilt. Children had grown old. Entire generations had come and gone. But some memories never truly left the heart. Elsa walked slowly along the narrow path wearing a dark wool coat and the same brown leather gloves Captain Thomas Reed had once given her inside the church basement so many winters ago. Time had softened the leather and faded the stitching at the fingertips, but she still wore them every December. In one hand, she carried a small bundle of white lilies wrapped carefully in paper. In the other rested an old black and white photograph protected inside a worn leather folder. She stopped finally before a simple marble headstone beneath a bare oak tree. Captain Thomas Reed, United States Army. The letters were clean and modest beneath a thin layer of snow. Elsa stood silently for a long moment. Around her, The cemetery remained peaceful except for distant wind moving through the trees and the soft sound of footsteps somewhere farther down the hill. She knelt carefully despite her age and brushed snow away from the base of the stone with her gloved hand. Then she placed the lilies gently beside it. For several seconds, she simply looked at the name. Not as a soldier now. Not as an American officer. Just Thomas. The man who had stayed when leaving would have been easier. Elsa slowly opened the leather folder and removed the old photograph. The edges had yellowed with time, but the image remained clear enough to see the faces. A group of exhausted American soldiers sitting inside a damaged church basement, surrounded by German children wrapped in blankets. Sergeant Brooks pretending to lose a card game, while little Marta laughed beside him. One soldier carving wooden animals near the stove, another pouring soup into tiny bowls. And near the center of the photograph, Captain Thomas Reed kneeling beside an 11-year-old girl while helping her pull oversized leather gloves on her frozen hands. Elsa traced the corner of the picture softly with her thumb. A younger visitor passing nearby glanced briefly toward her before continuing down the path. No one there knew the full story behind that photograph. No one knew how close those children had come to disappearing into the confusion after the war, or how a small group of tired American soldiers quietly refused to let that happen. Thomas and several men from his unit had fought for months to keep the children together. Some eventually found surviving relatives. Others were adopted by families connected to relief workers and military personnel. Little Marta grew up in Ohio. One of the boys became a schoolteacher in Boston. Another became a doctor in Chicago. Elsa herself later moved to America on a scholarship program supported by veterans who had never forgotten the church basement in Berlin. She became a translator, then a teacher, then eventually a grandmother. Life had continued the way life always does. Quietly, one season after another. But every winter, she returned here. Elsa looked down at the photograph once more before setting it carefully against the headstone. Snowflakes drifted slowly through the air around her. "You were the first American I ever trusted," she said softly. Her voice carried no bitterness anymore, only gratitude shaped by time. She smiled faintly to herself while remembering that freezing church basement filled with candlelight, soup steam, and soldiers trying awkwardly to comfort children who had forgotten what safety felt like. Back then, none of them understood they were building memories that would survive longer than the war itself. Elsa rested her gloved hand gently against the cold marble. "You once told me someone should stay," she whispered. "You did." Wind moved quietly through the cemetery trees above her. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang once in the distance. Elsa closed her eyes briefly, letting the sound settle into the silence around her. Then she looked toward the old photograph one final time. In the picture, the soldiers looked exhausted. The children looked thin and uncertain. The world around them had been shattered beyond repair. And yet somehow, inside that ruined church basement, kindness had survived anyway. Elsa smiled softly through tears she no longer tried to hide. "The war ended long ago," she whispered into the winter air. "But what you gave us never did."